I'm Grant Hunter, the Associate Minister for Red Tape Reduction, and I'm going to be emceeing this afternoon. We've been listening to entrepreneurs, businesses, nonprofits, and the public sector telling us that red tape is adding to the burden of doing business here in Alberta. These extra costs include time, money, and other resources are driving away jobs and investment. Alberta businesses and families end up paying the price. Today, I'm proud to stand here with Premier Jason Kenney and members of Alberta's business community and tell you how we're going to be taking back Alberta from being one of the most overregulated to one of the freest economies in Canada and North America. I'd like to, first of all, thank Roger Keglowicz, Chief Operating Officer for PCL Heavy Industry Operations, for hosting us here today. I'd also like to thank Laura Jones from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business for being part of today's announcement. Laura is the Executive Vice President and Chief Strategic Officer for CFIB. Laura?
Well, thank you very much, Minister Hunter. We're here this afternoon to talk about reducing red tape. And red tape, of course, can take many forms. Red tape can range from requiring that frustrating rule requiring that every change to a menu at a bar be approved by the AGLC, can be the complicated government form that requires a PhD in confusing language. It can be the process to come to a decision on a large project that takes 3 times as long as it should. And in all its many forms, large and small, red tape is a huge and unnecessary hidden tax on all Albertans. Red tape creates headaches and stress for citizens and small businesses. Red tape raises prices for consumers. Red tape reduces employment opportunities and incomes for our children. Red tape closes some businesses and stops others from ever opening. And new research shows that red tape increases poverty and income inequality. The problem is clear. The solution takes political will. The formula for reducing red tape has 3 essential ingredients. The first is strong political leadership from the top, and that's clearly on display today. The second is measurement to ensure accountability. And the final ingredient is a regulatory budget, a cap or a reduction target to stop the growth of red tape. Now, with this successful formula, with these 3 ingredients, political leadership, measurement, and a cap on regulation, British Columbia has cut its government rules virtually in half since 2001, while maintaining the important health, safety, and environmental outcomes that we all care about. The new government in Alberta has committed to all of the things in this successful formula and more. This is a very big deal, and we are very grateful because we're getting really tired of handing out D's and F's on our annual red tape report card. We've been handing out D's and F's for over a decade in this province. Premier, Minister, under your leadership, very much on display today, you are headed for a much improved grade. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Laura. Good timing.
Thank you, Laura. Now I'd like to invite Alberta's Premier, the Honourable Jason Kenney, to speak.
Thank you so much, Grant, and to Laura. Thanks to PCL for hosting us here, a great Alberta company, a global construction company that I gather started in Saskatchewan in 1906 and moved here in the 1930s, and we're proud of the work they do. But at this particular site, which produces products for our energy industry, I'm told that back a few years ago, 2017, there were as many as 800 people working in this shop, and this week we're at 80 people working in this shop, not long ago 20. This is a symbol of what has happened in Alberta's economy. And that's why Alberta's new government is obsessed with job creation, with getting Alberta back to work, with restoring investor confidence and showing the world that Alberta is open for business again. That's why this week we introduced the Carbon Tax Repeal Act and the Job Creation Tax Cut that will give us the most competitive taxes on job creators in Canada and almost the lowest in all of North America. But that's not enough to get our economy back to work. We also need to cut the mountain of red tape that is holding back our job creators. Red tape that kills jobs, red tape that drives away investment, red tape that costs months and years of costly delays. Red tape that we will begin with the law introduced today to cut, to move Alberta from being the slowest moving and most over-regulated economy in Canada to the freest and fastest moving economy in Canada, if not all of North America. In 2018, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business gave Alberta an F on its red tape report card, the only province in Canada for that to happen to. And meanwhile, our neighbors in British Columbia got an A. This is intolerable that this province, which we think of as the get-her-done entrepreneurial province, has been rated as the most over-regulated. It doesn't get worse than an F. Every day brings a new story about a pipeline stuck, a business crippled by bureaucracy, and endless projects that are being delayed. According to research produced by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, conventional wells can get approved in Texas in a few weeks, but it can take as long as 18 months here in Alberta. Imperial Oil had to wait for over 5 years for a green light on their new Christina Lake cutting-edge SAGD project, the kind of project that would create jobs at companies like PCL. 5 years of regulatory delays in the middle of a recession when a company was willing to risk billions of dollars to create jobs in our economy, it is totally unacceptable. And small businesses feel this burden heavier than anyone else because the mom and pop shops and small businesses, well, they're the folks who actually have to fill out all of the forms and contend with everyone from the revenue agency to the municipal zoning to provincial regulatory bodies. And for those businesses where the owner is the person who cleans the toilet at the end of the day, they just don't have the time or resources to deal with regulatory creep. These are reasons why we need to go from regulatory paralysis to job-creating action, and that's what Bill 4, the Red Tape Reduction Act, is all about. It creates a legislated target for us to reduce the regulatory burden of Alberta's government by at least 1/3. And we will do so, in part, by following the successful example of the British Columbia model, which Laura helped to develop and on which she has commented. They set a goal of cutting by 1/3 the red tape burden. Well, in their first 4 years, they managed to reduce it by 41%, and now I hear, Laura, nearly 50%. And this is not, it should not be a partisan football or a point of political contention, because my understanding is that the current NDP government is not questioning the model that was adopted, and so we hope that this will have a unanimous support from all parties in Alberta politics. Certainly it was a critical part of our platform in the recent election that was endorsed by over 55% of Albertans, with the largest Democratic mandate in Alberta electoral history. But as Laura said, for this to work requires sustained political attention. I'll be blunt. Previous governments in Alberta appointed task forces every few years to address what they knew was a problem, growing regulatory complexity, red tape, and they would have some meetings and industry would provide some input, and then things would sort of peter out over time with very little real progress being made. So we must learn from those failures. That's why we have appointed a designated minister to lead this project, and as Premier, have got his back. Grant's job is to go into every other minister's office and ensure that they are keeping pace with our ambitious targets every quarter, every year, through the 4 years of this mandate to hit or exceed the 1/3 target. And by the way, he will also be setting up panels with each major area of industry, from oil and gas, tourism, hospitality, agriculture and forestry, manufacturing and construction, like right here in PCL, small business, and nonprofits and charities. We're going to have another initiative in the Right to Care Act, which will be specifically about cutting red tape on nonprofits and charities so they're not encumbered by the same rules created for big businesses when they're just trying to help their neighbors. We'll also have a special focus on cutting red tape imposed by the provincial government on our municipalities and within the provincial government itself. One thing I can tell you from my experience as a federal minister was a lot of the inefficiency within government is unnecessary rules and procedures imposed by government on itself. So this is not just outward facing to the private sector, but also inward facing within the government sector. Today is an open invitation for Albertans to help us liberate our economy by cutting red tape. You can go to our website to our website, and there's a opportunity to provide input on dumb job-killing regulations, and Grant will be launching a broader government consultation process where anybody can provide that input. Through the Council of the Federation, which is all the premiers, we will be also pushing hard to speed up reform of the Canada Free Trade Agreement and further reduce barriers to trade, investment, and labor mobility and regulation. In fact, I made this point very clearly on a conference call with my 12 colleagues, provincial and territorial premiers, yesterday afternoon in preparation for the Council of the Federation meeting for it to be held in Saskatoon this summer. I said Alberta's #1 goal for the Council of the Federation now and in the years to come is to get to full free trade within Canada. It is outrageous that there are more barriers to the movement of goods and services and labor in these 10 provinces than the 28 sovereign member states of the European Union, and I and our government will push without relent to remove all exemptions and reservations that have been filed under the Canada Free Trade Agreement. Obviously, we have a great relationship with our neighbors in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and it's necessary to build on previous work with the government of British Columbia, and that's why at the Western Premiers meeting that I will be hosting in a month's time here in Edmonton, we will be focused on renewing the New West Partnership to knock down those barriers and red tape burden in the 4 Western provinces. To demonstrate how serious we are about deregulation, let me just review some of the red tape we've cut so far, even before this bill was introduced. In the 21 business days since our government took office, we've passed 17 orders in council related to red tape reduction. In fact, I think Grant has more floor time in the cabinet than any other minister. That amounts to cutting or reforming almost 1 regulation per business day. To give you an example, making it easier for charities and nonprofits to operate by modernizing banking requirements and offering multi-year rather than just annual funding agreements. Secondly, improving access to financial supports for agribusinesses by cutting unnecessary forms and red tape. Thirdly, simplifying permits for trucks traveling over provincial and municipal roads, and a whole lot more, which you can see in the releases from Executive Council. This is just a start. The work of red tape reduction will gather momentum with the passage of Bill 4 this spring. Our goal is to transform Alberta from one of the slowest moving and most over-regulated economies in Canada to one of the freest and fastest moving in the world. Before I take your questions, I wanted to invite for brief remarks some folks who have joined us who represent job creators in our economy. We've been joined by a number of them, but first I'd like to call on Tim McMillan, who is the president of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, representing Alberta's largest industry. Tim? Cheers.
Well, thank you, Premier. My comments will be brief, but it is really just to express the importance of this work, that for the last few years we've seen increasing capital leaving Canada, going to jurisdictions like the US. We're seeing rigs move, and red tape is something that is very often identified. It's apparent, it's something that we have been pushing for as an industry for a long time. Where we have regulations that are at times contradictory, that are inefficient, we know we can do better. That when we can maintain our high environmental and safety standards and do it in a more efficient way, that will mean creating more jobs here in Alberta. So I appreciate the efforts from the government to eliminate red tape early on in their mandate. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Cheers. And now I'd like to invite Janet Riopel, who's the president and CEO of the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce. And I know how hard she's been pushing for this kind of work, so I hope you guys will take yes for an answer.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Premier. You know, time is money, and maybe that holds true no more importantly than in the business environment. And reducing unnecessary, burdensome rules and regulations and processes, that duplication of efforts often, that overlap, that's very important to the business community. It's very important to make sure that business can get on with the thing that they do best, and that is creating jobs, generating a really dynamic economy. So we're really pleased with the actions these last few days, with the bills that have been announced, and with cutting red tape. We're really pleased to see that this government recognizes that Alberta can once again be a very attractive, a very competitive, dynamic environment, in fact, a magnet for investment and new businesses to come and be in Alberta by taking the actions and sending these strong signals and commitments that they have.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate that. And then finally, I'd like to invite Sandeep Lally, who came all the way up from Calgary. She is president and CEO of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for joining us, Sandeep.
Thank you, Premier. What I would say and add to my colleagues is that this is something we campaigned for in our policy platform. We said for every one regulation you're going to reduce 2 of them. What this all is about is unlocking the value that is in Alberta. So yes, we're open for business, but we need to unlock that value. And moving swiftly to unlock that value, the investment community is going to respond to that. And once you have investment flowing, you have jobs created, you have vibrant communities which come from vibrant business. And we are very encouraged that this is moving quickly to set the tone. And in business, if you set the tone from the top properly with this political will, you will have companies respond. So thank you again for these swift movements.
Thanks, Sandeep. Thank you so much. Cheers. I'll just close, and then I'm doing this different times. And I also wanted to acknowledge and thank, we also have Richard Truscott from the CFIB, who's joining Laura, and Malcolm Kirkland from Merit. And I want to thank them all for being here and participating. And now I am going to literally cut red tape. All right, we're going to be doing that a lot in the next few years. All right, so happy to take your questions.
Go ahead, Dean.
Can't see.
Hi, Dean. I can hear you, though.
Okay, question for you or the minister. I've only had a brief chance to look through the bill, but from what I can see, it empowers you to cut unnecessary regulations, but it doesn't define what an unnecessary regulation is. How do you define it, and perhaps will you, because I know that BC has a definition, will you be adopting that one?
Grant?
Thank you, Premier, and thank you for the question. So what we've done with this legislation is we've made sure that it's not prescriptive so that we can take a look at the best practices in other jurisdictions. We're going to take a look and make sure that it's relative, that it's effective, that it's efficient, and it's the responsibility of each of the departments to be able to make that determination.
So if I can then, because what's unnecessary can be in the eye of the beholder, right? So to give you an extreme example, an environmental review can be a drag on the business, but it serves a greater purpose. The legislation as it's drafted now gives executive council the ability to determine what's necessary and unnecessary. BC, I'm paraphrasing in theirs, they've defined it as a regulation that should have the time and cost of the regulation should pretty much approximate its benefit.
That's
And
right.
at the same time, while respecting public health, public safety, and the environment.
Yep.
Will you commit
Absolutely.
to amending your bill, to putting this in, to assure Albertans that what your guideposts are when you start cutting regulations?
So let me say, I think that BC definition is reasonable, but we're going to leave it to Cabinet to assess this. And Dean, in any event, the Executive Council or Cabinet has the full legal authority to impose and repeal regulations right now without any criteria. What we're trying to provide there are some general benchmarks to help guide the public service and our private sector partners and determine criteria against which they can operate. So I think that's a common sense definition. And Grant, he and I had a discussion about whether we should have a very prescriptive approach, and we decided it made more sense to leave some latitude and flexibility. But I wouldn't be closed about accepting an amendment like that. We'll consider that if one comes forward.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to hog it for one more question. BC had 330,812, they call them regulatory requirements, which is
Right.
different from regulation, and they cut that by 40%. So, Minister, you've had a month. How much do you have to cut? What's the total?
Well, my understanding is we have 1,200 regs, but we haven't yet got a full count on the total number of regulatory requirements, because embedded within each one of those regs, sometimes there might be hundreds of pages of specific reg requirements. So the first item on Grant's work agenda in his mandate letter is to get a whole of government count, a benchmark, as of May the 1st, 2019, on the total number of regulatory requirements. And I assume you're already doing that, Grant, right? Yes. He says yes. Did you want to comment on that, Laura, at all? Maybe just add some color. Sorry, Emma.
No, that's okay. If you've got thoughts, get them off your chest.
I think getting the measure right is very important, and being comprehensive and looking at the regulatory requirements, because the devil is in the detail, and it's often the 10-page form that could be 2 pages. That is really the problem, and it is the cumulative burden of regulation that's a big problem for small business. But I just wanted to make one other comment about about what happened in British Columbia with regards to health, safety, and environmental outcomes that we all care about, because it is really important to maintain those outcomes. And one of the features of the British Columbia model is that the regulators themselves are an important, really, really important part of this. And their jobs essentially change from regulation makers, where my job is just to create more regulations, to regulation managers, where they are looking at what are the most important rules to maintain and protect, and as new ones come in, what old ones maybe aren't necessary anymore, and to get out. And I think they've done a fabulous job of that in British Columbia. So it really is a good partnership between the private and the public sectors in that regard.
Sorry, Emma.
No, that's okay. Good point. You talked there about some regulations that have already been cut through orders in council. Now, none of those were actually included in the public notifications about what's been done through orders in council. So how will the public know about what exactly is being cut and who cut it?
I thought orders in council were published about 2 days after every executive council. I'm still
I went and checked, but there's nothing in regards to any of them.
I'll ask that those be released immediately. I am still new to the job and the technical reporting schedule. I can say, though, that not all of, I think while we've cut those eliminated 17 regs, there have been additional policy changes that are kind of below regulatory status. So in some cases, through ministerial order, and that's part of this. When we talk about red tape, we're including, yes, orders in council, formal legal regulations, but also policies that are created typically by ministerial orders, or sometimes by departmental interpretation. So there's different categories, but certainly we're happy to release those, and I'll ask the Communications and Public Engagement Office of the Executive Council to do so as quickly as possible.
So will it be kind of like a working list? So will you have a record somewhere on a website or something like,
Yes.
here are the regulations we have cut, so the public can kind of say, okay, they're down by almost a third now? Is
That's
that what you're
exactly
thinking?
the goal, because frankly, we want to create a sense of positive competition within different ministers to meet the goals. It's going to take us a bit of time to get to stand up first of all, to complete the benchmarking, the count of all the regulatory requirements, and then to set up a reporting system, but that's all in Grant's work plan.
And just briefly, the rail car deal, are you still committed to cutting that deal and getting rid of it altogether?
We think it's a bad deal for Alberta. We need more oil to move by rail, and we believe the private sector should be doing that, that the cost and risks associated with it should be borne by the private sector. We believe the deal that was signed during the formal campaign period was well above market rates and was the single largest fiscal expenditure in the history of the Alberta government. To do something that the private sector would, under the right market conditions, do anyway. Since the government big-footed into the crude by rail market, Imperial Oil canceled a planned increase of their shipments by about 80,000 barrels a day. So you got private sector players with the infrastructure, in principle, ready to roll at the right price point. We are still undergoing a legal analysis of all of that. As I have said before, we hope that we can find private sector partners who will take over those contractual obligations from the Crown and to assume the risks themselves. So we will be engaging in conversations with private sector partners in that regard.
Just on that same subject briefly, did you get a response from your letter to was it CN or?
I sent a letter to both the CEOs of Canadian Pacific and Canadian National on, I believe, February 20th of this year, the day after the former Premier made an announcement, underscoring that a future UCP government would be opposed to contracts of this nature signed without transparency during the formal campaign period, further to the statement I had made on February the 1st of this year, that we would rigorously scrutinize contracts signed during the legal campaign period to protect the taxpayers' interest. To the best of my knowledge, I have not received a response, at least to either of those letters of February 20.
Right. Okay, now on to this red tape reduction. This has been tried several times in Alberta before, and I think, in fact, there was a minister, it might not have been called the same thing, but Luc Ouellette had the job of, back in the Klein days, of heading one of these red tape reduction sort of initiatives. Didn't go anywhere. There were several others, I think, in the meantime.
Yeah.
One under Redford, I think, even. One under Stelmach. They both kind of fizzled.
Agreed.
Yeah. Part of the reason, and I've spoken to ministers that have been involved with those past ones, was that the civil service is pretty resistant to this kind of thing, and that they're experts in smoke and mirrors. And
Do you have a question, Rick?
Well, how are you going to avoid this time? I mean,
Well, Rick, I said exactly what you did a moment ago about how there have been, I would characterize them as half-hearted efforts in the past. I think they were well-intentioned, but they just didn't have sustained political focus from the top. And this was one of our 3 or 4 central campaign commitments. It is the 4th bill that we're introducing in this legislature, in this new legislature, for a reason. There is a fully dedicated associate minister behind this, and with not only my backing, but my constant surveillance. So I'm going to be all over this every cabinet meeting. I can tell you it's already happening, and the public service has got the message. Now, let me say, in the defense of the public service, that many of the regs we've already cut were things that they had on the shelf ready to go, which apparently the previous government would not act on. And they're bringing forward stuff I never dreamed of, which are good ideas to reduce complexity. And so far, we're getting nothing but great cooperation from the public service. I'm very encouraged by that. My own experience as a minister in Ottawa was that public servants are professionals who want to do good work, and they're eager to be given a big task like this. So I'm actually pretty optimistic we're going to get great cooperation, but we do need to plug into the private sector. And I said this to my friends here before the announcement. I said, you guys need to give us chapter and verse of where there are deadweight regs that are holding back the economy, and that's just not like some token 2 or 3 meetings. This is going to be going on a monthly basis for 4 years.
Okay, final quick question. BC, I think, is doing a 2-for-1, where every regulation is cut, every 2 regulations, that are, whatever. You're doing a 1-for-1 according to your platform.
Yeah.
Why?
Because my experience in federal government was that sometimes the 2-for-1 requirement slowed down fast action on good policy. I'll give you an example. When I would come up with smart new immigration policy that would be good for the economy, that required a reg package to implement, PCO, Privy Council Office, would say to me, sorry, Minister, where are your 2-for-1 offsetting cuts? And then the bureaucracy would tell me it would take 18 months to come up with that list. I didn't want to put ourselves in a situation where fast action on smart policy would be delayed unreasonably by a 2-for-1 requirement. 1-for-1 is a lighter touch, and Laura tells me BC has moved to 1-for-1. Do you want to supplement?
So BC started at 2-for-1 until 2004, and then post-2004 they've been 1-for-1, and interestingly they've continued to reduce even under the 1-for-1 policy. If I may just make another quick comment on the history of regulatory reform, you're absolutely right, is littered with failure. And so the appropriate question is, you're absolutely right, what makes this different? And I talked about 3 critical ingredients for success, because from the private sector, we're sick of the failure too, right? How many well-intentioned regulatory reform initiatives have we been involved in where we've been asked, bring us your top 10 irritants, right? And while they're working on the top 10 irritants, and we may get 5 of them addressed, there's hundreds more piling up. And so what makes this different is 3 things. Political leadership from the top, because it comes across government, which is important. Measurement, which means we in the private sector are also going to be holding you guys accountable, and we'll have measures to do that, right? And then the third thing is a constraint, either in the form of 2-for-1 and then 1-for-1, or a 1-for-1, that means that you can't just keep adding to the pile. And those things have been proven to be such an effective formula that it's not just Alberta that's looking to follow that formula. There are dozens of U.S. states lining up to find out what British Columbia did. There are countries asking for information about what British Columbia did. But what's great about Alberta is they're sticking to the formula. There are a lot of states who are kind of doing it half-heartedly, but these guys look to have it right.
Dean, I'll give you one more, and then I'm getting the signal I'm running late for my next thing.
I appreciate it, Premier. Just to clarify, because you've talked about regulations across government, and then you said regulations to spur the economy. And those can be 2 different things.
Right.
So can you just clarify?
Sure.
So when
Bill number 4, I'll clarify, good question. Bill 4 and today's announcement is about reducing the red tape burden on the Alberta economy. As a complementary and separate initiative, we'll be focusing on red tape reduction on nonprofits and charities. And as part of our efforts to find efficiencies in government, we'll also be doing that in terms of internal red tape. We also made a separate commitment in the municipal section of our platform to reduce mandates imposed by the province on municipalities. So you've got the big one is this private sector piece, then there will be separate nonprofits, municipalities, and provincial government, but many of them have common characteristics.
And you'll be prioritizing them in that order.
Yes,
We'll
indeed.
focus on the economy ones first.
Well, yeah, that's why we're starting right now with this. Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it.